Hi all. In this talk, we're going to think about inflation and to some extent interest rates, but we're also going to look at the extreme case of shocks to the system. We have plenty of examples of this in the past where as a result of circumstances, hyperinflation has gripped an economy, usually as a result of politics. If we look at Zimbabwe, for example, and the hyperinflation there, the 10 units of currency lost its value, it lost its purchasing power. And this is the thing with inflation, that money is almost just like another commodity. If suddenly there is a vastly excessive supply over it, and people lose confidence in it as a commodity, then money no longer has purchasing power. And in a hyperinflation, the problem is so intractable that government cannot pay its employees, and so it has to print more and more and bigger denomination notes. I think Zimbabwe got to the sort of 1 trillion note, which had no more purchasing power than 10 of the unit by the time they'd finished. And there'd been a number of hyperinflation incidents following political upheaval in France at the time of the revolution. Sort of going back to the 1790s, there was suddenly the ability of the state to pay its employees was lost, partly through poor harvests, civil discord, civil disruption, and war, because having removed their monarch, the sort of crowned heads of Europe then assembled armies on French borders, and the French state had to make payments increasingly using its ability to print money, to print the unit. And the result was hyperinflation. Of course, if the social turmoil that had happened was as a result of distress among the lower paid, inflation made that all the worse, in that their principal expenditure was sort of food, fuel, shelter, and suddenly these things became ruinously expensive, and the price of bread on the street was such that people couldn't afford it. And of course, billionaires, and they had their billionaires back then. Billionaires don't feel this. For them, that's not something they've, if they have experienced it in their youth, they're very determined not to experience it again. So we can see from the extreme case of hyperinflation that government is trying to curate all the time its ability to pay its employees, and it does this through taxation. Again, in hyperinflation, the problem is that tax liabilities are settled in money of 1 year, and in a year's time, in a true hyperinflation, the money is valueless. So the money that government raise is useless as a form of payment for its employees. The other way that government finances itself is through borrowing, and the curating, again, this principle of prudence, the sort of being a prudent borrower, and not casting prudence to the winds, to listening to people like the Office of Budget Responsibility and so on, and not being sort of novel. This prudence, this principle of prudence, is so vital, because once that's lost, once the ability of the government to borrow is lost, and its taxation revenues are not raising sufficient to pay its employees, and you're simply left with monetization and the issuing of what is essentially a worthless commodity, which has lost its purchasing power. So the extreme case indicates why such care is taken of money. Why doesn't government simply print? I mean, there are always voices that say, oh, well, it's why don't you just print the money? For example, on a sort of crash investment program or something, we just print. Well, the trouble is, ultimately, history shows, and history is rather more vivid than mathematics, in that once these sort of economic broils happen, it has a psychological impact on the society. Violence becomes more widespread, and people take less care of themselves. If they see a government being imprudent, why should people be prudent? And what tends to happen is there's a sort of reversion to banditry, and if the government cannot secure property and peace, and so a civil peace, then you get this spectre. It suddenly appears and grows, and it's sort of blown in unpredictable ways by the psychological impact on the people of a loss of confidence, and inevitably governments sort of exercise their control through terror in the final analysis, through arbitrary execution. So happily, these examples from history are extreme, but are they rare? Inflation is very much with us at the moment, and as in Zimbabwe, the program of land reform devastated the productive agriculture, so there wasn't any food, and political decisions don't necessarily take into account economic decisions. So you get this spectre of things assuming a momentum of their own, and because of the sort of distributional asymmetry, when we look at how the CPI is made up, it's people on low incomes who are most affected, and people who have the least stake in society. Now, of course, the sort of mature Western society is a very different profile from, revolutionary France or Weimar Germany in the wake of the First World War and the mistakes that were made at Versailles. But nonetheless, the world continues to surprise with shocks, and obviously a prudent government is managing its payroll pretty tightly. I mean, one of the things that we saw yesterday when we were having a look at productivity was this slightly surprising finding, really, that the UK government employs 6 million people. All credit. We wouldn't want to be without nurses, teachers, and so on. But nonetheless, a prudent government is all the time improving its ability to survive shocks. Because as the transaction costs of government, if they're not managed and if they mount up, then you start to get a drift. And economists tend to talk in terms of transport analogies. The oil tanker going for the economy going forward as the oil tanker, or a big jet airliner, the soft landing, and so on. So where you have political foolishness, partly as a result of the stresses and strains of 7 billion, nearly 8 billion people getting along with one another, that raises signals, and that the patient work that's done understanding what is going on in daily life is very important. The sort of fine-tuning which occurs of primarily through interest rates and the management of credit and demand, and if things are heating up a little bit too much, we'll upgo the interest rates. That works in the short term, but the government will need to have an eye to the long term. It's terribly difficult for politicians to take much interest in the long term, naturally, because of the weight of events that are with them. So the independence that's been achieved, a measure of independence for the Bank of England, and this adherence to the 2% target, this has come from basically copying what works. We know what works. We know that letting inflation run away doesn't work. We know the impact that has. It's again, the voices, you hear the voices, well, if we let inflation rip, then the national, we're paying back in depreciated pounds and so on. But because of the way the economy is joined up, and because of the tools that we have, that we sort of learn these economic tools, we can see the folly of that, in that as confidence in the government's borrowing ability is eroded, and its a willingness to tackle inflation and willingness to control its expenditure and control its payrolls and manage, numbers of government employees. Um, if confidence in that goes, then the ability to borrow goes, um, in some degree, and you can end up in a spiral. And all the time there is the unexpected, which can, we shouldn't assume the best of all cases, because there is constant pressure on energy. Wonderful things are being done, um, um, in terms of getting control, um, over this, and in people talking to each other, and in making institutions work. Again, you hear these voices, oh, we should pull out of this institution, or put, no, we have to make these things work. And I think there is an especial responsibility, um, uh, among billionaires, not simply to regard the economy as a casino, as they tend to. I mean, how much money do they need? And if their activities interfere with the productive capacity of the economy and the stability of government and the effectiveness of government in managing its payrolls, there are limits to what the tools available to economists can achieve. So, there is particular responsibility there in terms of um, uh, where this money is ending up, with left or right, um, and to the extent it's undermining institutions, that cannot be tolerated, and only informed citizens who inform themselves about economics, about politics, about society, that is the only protection, because, as they say, democracy is the toughest form of government there is, but it's better than all the rest. So, bye for now, and see you next time.